First of all, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about myself and who I am and where I've come from. And then I'm going to talk about the title of the presentation, which is in fact also the title of a book that is currently in process of being published. And towards the end of the presentation, I'll put up a web link, or you can drop your email into the swap card and I will send you a free edition of it as you have been here this morning. So I've been in the tech world since 1985. And I guess the common theme in terms of everything that I've done over those last 35 years is change. So when I first started to work, Unix was new, open systems was the zeitgeist at the time. And then it became client server and then multi-tier systems and so forth. Around about 2004 or 2000 rather, I started working in the whole area of technical debt. And that was the first time that I worked with Agile. That became a focus. Thereafter, I started working with Dacia in 2004, predominantly with clients in the financial services sector, but also with the European Space Agency, which is where I kind of came back to Agile again, this time Agile and quality and how to align those things together. Since 2005, we've been working with our clients pretty much full on with DevOps solutions. We work, as Sebastian alluded earlier, with the DevOps Institute and also with some tools providers. So why the book? Well, I guess the first thing was that over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, I've been attending various conferences and so forth. And I had my own ideas that I hadn't heard elsewhere. And then I also, about a year ago, unwittingly committed to writing a book for the DevOps Institute. So when lockdown came, it gave me a little bit of room in which to do that. And I guess at the heart of what I wasn't hearing from others was the idea that the processes and tools were amongst the easier part of it. A lot of the presentations I went to seemed to indicate that processes and tools were the hard part, but actually what I found, it was really changing how people behave towards one another was what made things most difficult. So people have different organization structures, different management styles, attitudes towards technology in general and risk in particular. And I was listening to a lot of these presentations through the ears of my customers. And those customers tended to have two fundamental issues: difficulty in changing how they delivered technology. And then the other was an inability to realize or recognize customer value from technology. And those were really kind of the effects of not having the voice of the customer in their businesses. So probably the last 5 years in particular, and the last 6 months in more particularly, have concentrated our clients more and more, because our clients have tended to be kind of the bricks and mortar type, and they're struggling behind hot and happening tech startups. And what I was seeing was two things, I guess. The tech startups, they can be unicorns faster than a traditional business can digitally transform itself. And the other was that the tech startups and these unicorns are able to turn on the sixpence, while our customers were stuck in these older rhythms, releasing features perhaps once or twice a year. So the one feature at a time, let me just explain a little bit, first of all, the subtitle, cultural debt. So cultural debt is the idea that a corporation's culture in some way and to various degrees gets in the way of realizing the true opportunity that the organization has at hand. So in ways, the corporation is getting in the way of itself. Another way of understanding it is that cultural debt increases when an organization fails to keep its promises to its stakeholders. So that could be the staff, the customers, and so forth. So the second part really speaks to the business purpose of wanting to release one feature at a time. So why would you ever want to do that? And I guess that's because you feel the need to catch up with those digital natives. If you look at a company like Booking.com, at any moment in time, they're running 1,000 ongoing experiments. Think of an experiment as a feature. So any one time, there's 1,000 ongoing experiments. And in any one year, they will run between 20 and 30,000 experiments. Now, it's important to understand that 90% of those experiments fail, and it's the 10% that work that keep them at it. But, you know, Booking.com, they were born in the cloud. They've no incumbent technology. You know, their processes are based more so on forgiveness rather than permission. So how the book's title then is FaaT, it's about introducing a new behavior change framework that will allow companies to get after those nimbler competitors, be they digital or not. So the ways of working that we talk about here can work not just for products that are technology dependent, but products in general, because as we know, Agile spans all aspects of a business, not just the technology delivery piece. In the course of this presentation, I will talk a lot about business to consumer facing applications because it's easier for me to do that in the context of explaining customer value. But everything I talk about has applicability in B2B or back office, but I just happen to use business to consumer facing examples. And I will pick my way through what I see as 10 behavioral blockers. These are 10 behaviors that typically exist in older organizations with more traditional ways of working. And part of the problem for these organizations is that before you ever listen to me, you can probably identify these blockers to progress when they arise, but they don't necessarily arise in a predetermined way. So if you're in the business trying to deliver value to business customers, keep the lights on, deal with the stresses of hiring and firing, and I guess, you know, the CEO's phone, well, these behavioral blockers, they crop up randomly. And so the purpose of this presentation and the book is to suggest preventive courses of action and provide a framework for behavior change. So these changes can be made on the fly or as you discover them, right? So what we find is when we're delivering a solution, there's no budget for changing people. It's through solution delivery and private training that we address the behavioral blockers, predominantly by facilitating people's own realization of the change that's required. I mean, you don't actually say to people change and then they change. People resent being told to change, not change itself. I think it's Peter Seng who said that. So like with all change journeys and all things and places you want to go, it's good to have a North Star. And in the book and in the tech industry in general, a lot of us make reference to a gentleman by the name of Ron Westrum. And I do this as well a little bit in the book because he talks about three fundamental cultures. There's the pathological, bureaucratic, and generative. And the best way to explain these in shorthand is to give the analogy of a messenger. So if a messenger comes with bad news in a pathological or power-oriented structure, the messenger can be shot. In a bureaucratic or consensus-driven type culture, messengers will generally get an audience, but there can be meetings about meetings, or perhaps it's the problem that's been identified. Nobody really wants to take ownership for it to solve it. And in both of those environments, nothing much changes because effectively the messengers are either shot or ignored. And yet in the generative culture, those messengers with bad news are seen as opportunities to improve, opportunities to perhaps collaborate across silos, pursue common goals, and where failures and accidents are treated as opportunities to learn rather than as a reason for witch hunts. Another definition for a generative culture that I like is that a generative culture will deliver comparatively more original value from more people on a regular basis. So that means probably more discretionary effort. There's more company-wide social interactions. It's a more pleasant place to work. People want to get out in bed in the morning because they feel they have a sense of purpose. So now that we know what good looks like for a company culture, the challenge is, well, how do we get there? And so what we're going to do is we're going to start to look at the first of the behavioral blockers. Now, in the book, there's over 30,000 words and 180 pages. I go all out in terms of cause, effect, the challenges for the coalition of the willing. I'll talk about the coalition of the willing in a second. But today I'm just picking out some thoughts and thoughts and ideas. and I make a little bit of, the occasional suggestion. There's a major caveat with my suggestions. Your context is unique. Now, the content in the book and in this presentation and the suggested courses of actions and so forth, they're based on Dacia's collective experience, primarily with bricks and mortars financial services company. But where you are at is unique, and I'm not familiar with it. So anything that I suggest here, you need to think through carefully in context of your own organization. So let's start at the top then of the organization, and let's talk a little bit about the C-suite. So when I say the C-suite, I mean anyone with the word chief in their job title. So COO, CTO, that collective group is the C-suite. And in general, the C-suite outside of the CIO and the CTO tend to have a fear of technology. There's this nervousness about existing systems, scar tissue from earlier IT projects that perhaps ran over budget, under-delivered, and they're now brittle. So every time we make a small change, they tend to break. Not only is there a fear of technology, there can also be a fear of technologists. More so the sense that they're somehow indispensable. And by the way, that may also be true. It could be that there are some critical systems and we are critically dependent on some people. But unfortunately, though, that indispensability only gets worse unless we tackle those brittle systems. But that nervousness, that scar tissue, that fear of technology, which is also kind of a fear of change in a way, it undermines an organization's capacity to envisage a brighter digital future. Excuse me. So my own experience talking to people in the C-suite, if I had €1 for every time I heard them say things like, that won't work here because we've legacy systems, or we don't have any budget for this. 80% of our budget is spent towards keeping the lights on. And a lot of our recent work, with the recession in mind, is how do we repurpose that budget? But the focus has to be how do we change the C-suite mindset? And one thing that I've seen work really, really effectively is case studies. So we do lunch and learns and that kind of stuff where we'll present how other organizations, peer organizations have done things, and particularly the results. So that has to look like, better, more profitable, better share price, growing market share, all of the above. And then the argument must run with people on the C-suite, either whether you're a part of that team or whether you're reporting into that team. Look, if peers can do things at lower cost, greater ROI, faster than us, then we have a problem. Now, in all of this, there can sometimes be the reluctant CEO. And in a lot of the organizations that we deal with, the CEOs can be quite command and control. Perhaps they've grown up through the business, they've quite long tenure in the business. So when we want to institute change, or initiate change rather, and gather around a coalition of the willing, if you like, we need to get the CEO to kind of feel like it's his idea. But as I said earlier, caveat emptor, not all CEOs are created equal. So, and in the book, I go into this in more detail. Now, this can be a very hard thing to do when the business is humming along nicely, if the numbers are good. There's a guy I quote that I quite like called Charles Handy. I think his book was called The Age of Paradox. And his point was that what brought us to where we are is unlikely to bring us forward because the world changes. That's the only constant, is the change that's in the world around us. So we can't expect that the things that we've done to date are going to, make us successful into the future, because products die off, new competitors come in and so forth. But the problem is that when organizations are humming along nicely, it's when they're at their most vulnerable, but it's when their self-belief is at its greatest and it's hardest to kind of dislodge them. And I don't underestimate the challenge. Very often it needs to come in the form of some form of shock or sudden unanticipated change that like the virus, that causes everybody to sort of rethink. When it's humming along like that, the complacency is the enemy of curiosity. And you really need to have people who are complacent. You really need to have people who are curious about their competitors, et cetera, so that they can start to envisage ways and means to make things better, even if things are going really, really well. I recall a CEO I was doing some work with, and he's heads up a very successful organization, and he got wind of a competitor beating him in one market. His business is throughout, he's an $8 billion business, and one market he was starting to lose to one competitor, and he just turned the company upside down because he began to realize that actually his technology was pretty poor. So the C-suite then, what we really want to do is we want them to be led ideally by a CTO, not led by, but augmented by a CTO who can help the C-suite to understand the business opportunity that technology offers and unlock the company from its past. So we don't want to be prisoners of our past. This person, this CTO, should be able to help see through the fog, the techno-babble, if you like, and grasp the opportunity, and to start to get the C-suite to understand that new ways of working will be required. And that might involve flatter structures, technology people and business teams in merging and working more closely together. And one thing to watch out for here, there's in the book I talk about common hacks and mistakes that we see. And one of the mistakes I've seen, I'm working with a client at the moment in the insurance sector, is this idea that we set up IT as a custodian of the old, while perhaps the business builds the new systems. I mean, I've seen Gartner call this bimodal, but in my mind, this is just marketing speak. It's nonsense, really. Whatever about building new applications, ultimately the old data and possibly the old code will need to be integrated, and the teams of people who are going to want to own these products moving forward need to be pulled together. So rather than having one group heading off into the past and one group heading off into the future, and then trying to bring them together at the end, it just doesn't work. So you're better off, in my opinion, and a recommendation would be to make sure that the existing and new teams are working side by side where possible in teams. Come on to that a little bit later. Okay, let's look at the next then. The next behavioral blocker is, a suggestion. Every now and then I'll make a suggestion. So if you're working with the C-suite or reporting into them, one thing you could do is share a case study, either a YouTube, et cetera. But find one that's a relevant case study and share it with them. Okay, let's talk a little bit about one of the fundamental problems then, one of the fundamental blockers is this idea of fiefdoms, as distinct from, a silo or a function or a department. A fiefdom is a silo plus a leader who behaves like a prince in a way, as defined by our friend Machiavelli, who actually wasn't a prince himself. He was in fact a medieval consultant who consulted medieval princes. And he was a very misunderstood character. Allegedly, he never said the end justifies the means. And when he got his advice to princes incorrect, he was chucked in jail and tortured. So I guess the modern equivalent is a CXO being shown the door by the CEO if things don't pan out. So fiefdoms can be very destructive because they tend to get in the way of satisfying a customer's demand. The book is full of anecdotes, and one of them is an anecdote from a time when I was working with a client explaining new ways of working, and he just said straight out, look, this isn't going to work here. Let me explain to you how we work in this organization. And recently they'd had a fire with a customer. By the way, the customer was on fire. He wasn't able to get good delivery. And there was the C-suite had gathered to sort of put out the fire. Two people had a hose, but they didn't want to use the hose until they saw that one of their colleagues was being well and truly burnt. And so they only restored the customer services when they won their political internecine battle that was running on. So fiefdoms tend to be functional silos that compete for resources. And the problem here now is that we have some real value in some silos, insights perhaps into customers' needs, which desperately needs to be added to other skills in other silos like engineering and so forth. So what's the solution and how do we get there? Well, it's longer than I can go into in this presentation, but ultimately where we want to get to is delivery teams. It's a term I've borrowed from the UK government. It's a group of between 8 and 12 people that has all of the resources and skills they require to get one feature at a time into production quality. So that may or may not be live. That's down to your own organization, how they want to deploy features. So how do you break down the silos in the first instance? It's obvious to say, well, look, we need to align everyone's interests. But one technique I observed is where the CEO will say to a subgroup of the Cs, look, your task is to remove blockers to digital transformation. So these delivery teams that we're forming, they're going to run into obstacles. Quite probably those obstacles exist between the silos. But now you're saying to a group of Cs, the CEO empowers them to go ahead and do what they need, because we want our delivery teams to be urgent. And if they're blocked, they need to be able to go to a C team and become unblocked, get them to release the resources they require or whatever they might need. And this works quite well, because when the CEO empowers this team, if they are the problem, or if the problem is just the layer below them, they're going to be embarrassed to go back to the CEO. So they'll really want to try and resolve the problem themselves. I mean, in general, one of the problems we have with older school organizations is this hierarchy. It tends to block the voice of the customer. I think the other thing that needs to be done when you pull these teams together is to have what's called a definition of done. It's an absolutely critical aspect of it. So I alluded earlier to the fact that we have one feature and it's in production. Perhaps we could also say that the technical debt is going to be repaid at some point in the future. It's adding value. Here's the amount of value it's adding, and it's live and deployed and so forth. So done, however, could start for some organizations, some of our clients start back with just continuous integration. So we want to get our engineers to integrate code. I mean, I have one client who was integrating code every 6 months. So we're trying to work with them to integrate their code, once a week and then once a day and so forth. And then we can move forward. So the key here is that the delivery teams are empowered, self-organized, autonomous, and they evolve done. So if we start out with knowing that we want to do continuous integration, but ultimately we want to get to this other place where it's a much more highly evolved form, then we're really trying to challenge the team to as leaders, unblock what is in their way to help them get to that more highly evolved place. So my suggestion here would be to get the team together and discuss done. In the book, it's an appendix, but I've written the language in the book in that section so that business people understand it. And a tip to business people and anyone really in the process of trying to release one feature at a time is, when you speak to people in the organization, is there a consensus about what done is? Some people will talk about that from their perspective. Well, done for me is code coverage at 90%. They're just giving you a metric for their silo. What we really need is an end-to-end metric. Something like cycle time will work quite well. Okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about that's a blocker, a behavioral blocker, is zero risk taking. Now, earlier we alluded to the fact that if you shoot or ignore messengers, then you really are dissuading people from thinking about taking small risks. Perhaps they are impeded in their day-to-day. They're somewhat a little bit frustrated perhaps about how they're doing things, and they have perhaps the idea of doing something better, perhaps lower cost or a happier customer way of doing something. And what we want to do is encourage them to kind of have a crack at something, but not bet the farm. So in that scenario, what we really want to do is define what we mean by a risk. And if we can actually say that a risk is something that you can roll back and for which the downside has been foreseen, then it is, we want to empower people to take that kind of risk. It's probably a step-like function to get there, because if your culture today is to not necessarily encourage people to take a risk, then it's got to be something that you'll have to lead out on somewhat carefully in conversation. But one of the things that I've seen work quite well is to encourage a kind of a forgiveness over permission type approach. And you see this with a lot of the digital natives. And you could start this, one of our clients, we started this where it was okay to do this as long as there was no customer impact. So if it was just an impact that could be felt internally, then we would actually allow this, and for which the downside had been foreseen. And at some levels, it doesn't matter if the experiments that these folks make pays off or not. It's just that we're trying to get a different sentiment. Now, the next thing I want to talk about that's quite unusual, but one thing I've noticed is a lot of companies, when they're trying to understand what's going on around them, they tend to ignore the competition. Now, I think there's a bunch of reasons why this happens. Sometimes organizations are a monopoly. They perhaps are too present in their own fiefdom. So it's a strange one, but it's one that really needs to be addressed, particularly if a team of people are struggling to motivate their colleagues to change. The classic here in our experience is we see organizations, they have what they call burning platforms. But in our experience, those burning platforms tend to turn up too late, and nobody really believes in the burning platform. It's a bit like what I was talking about earlier. Sometimes these burning platforms can feel a bit sort of artificial, if you like. So what we've done with some clients is prepared a workshop. And this data here that I'm presenting is a means by which to help a coalition of the willing come together. And what we want to do is look at companies that we compete with under these headings. So the first heading is the number of authentic roles. So what I mean by this is sometimes people will go on a training course. Let's say they're a project manager. They go on a training course, they're a product owner, and they retitle but if they've only been a product manager for a wet day, then they're not really a product manager. So you really need to look at not just the job titles, but the duration. Are they involved in meetups? Do they share their knowledge? Do they seem to be agile? So that's the first thing to look at. The next is the number of those roles relative to the total size of the team. I'm minded here of a story from a client who had who talked about the sort of the competition between the forces for change and the forces for no change. And if the forces for no change had senior people and more people, then the forces for change would have to recruit faster and more senior people more quickly, or else the battle would be lost. Has there been, in your review of the competition, has there been a hire of a new CEO or of a new chief people officer? Is there evidence that they're flattening out the business, flattening out the hierarchy, listening more to their customers? And at the end of the day, kind of the acid test to all of this is, well, which of these companies is responding faster to the others? And that's kind of your way of validating the data here to the left-hand side. So if we look at Great Company for a minute, they are the most responsive, and guess what? They seem to have more authentic people. So the whole thing stacks up. Down here is your organization, and this is where the debate starts once you fill in this data. I want to emphasize, by the way, that this is not a substitute for other ways of keeping in touch with the customer. And one particular client of ours, one of the larger banks, their executives were encouraged to use the competition's product. And in this particular instance, the bank, one of the bank execs was traveling in Switzerland near the Alps, and the competitor's product woke up and offered him an insurance add-on to his existing policy to cover dangerous sports. And the exec was really, really impressed. I mean, they were merging geoposition data, weather information, and CRM data to make a unique offer in an automated fashion. And he understood that his organization was in the halfpenny place relative to that particular competitor. So the ways that you have of engage in competition and understand them, the old ways need to persist. But you also need to understand your digital fitness, like how fit are you? So my top tip here is research just one competitor, ideally the one that you think is most nimble. Okay, so the next issue that faces a lot of organizations is seeing IT as cost and treating IT as cost. And that tends to lead to a mindset around, let's get best value for money and most utilization out of our resources. But invariably that leads to too much work in progress and cycle times that just get too long. So finance functions and the people that you need to engage in the finance side of things, they like to think about software development in manufacturing terms. And they like lean language and they like Six Sigma language. But let's be clear, that only works when you know that you are building the right thing. Then you want to focus on building the thing right. But when you don't know what the features that you want to develop are, then you've got a broad product area, but we're now at a granular level of features. You need what's called hypothesis-driven development. And this needs a different approach to financing software build. So when we want to build and release features all together as one big release, we tend to have a long-term capital commitment, and we depreciate that back into the P&L. But in fact, when we want to build things in an iterative way, in a short feature at a time type way, then what we want to do is we want to actually have the costs and the revenues in the same accounting period, because we're going to build a feature, see if it works. If it does, recognize the revenue. If it doesn't, deprecate it and move on. So I like to encourage our clients, when tech teams and finance teams are engaged, to have a common language. And this should be the common language of money and probability. So businesses are used to sales forecasts, which come with client name and a certain percentage and a certain value. And in the same way, we should be able to say, well, this feature is going to cost us 15,000, but there's a 25% chance that it'll realize 100,000. And we can then present all of our features that we want to experiment with in this fashion and change the conversation from IT as cost to IT as customer value. And my suggestion here is have a conversation. What you'll find is that the finance teams are quite comfortable to talk about expensing software in a period. They don't have to invent any accounting rules to do that. Okay, so we're starting to get our teams mobilized. We're starting to rather think about building software more iteratively. We've floated the idea about delivery teams. Our coalition of the willing is hopefully sufficiently spooked about the competition that they want to actually go talk to finance and get some funding as well. The next thing we're going to need is ideas, lots of ideas to feed into our innovation team, into our one FaaT machine, our one feature at a time machine. And generally speaking, our clients have a problem with low levels of innovation. And it goes back to this idea that, have we encouraged them to take a risk? The other problem that arises for a lot of organizations, and this is true in digital transformation as well, is that people tend to see digital transformation as a silo in its own right, when in fact it's everybody's problem. It's a bit like ISO certifications from before. Everybody was impacted and everybody benefited from ISO. And it's the same with digital transformation. Steve Jobs said the best ideas should win, not the loudest voice. And he went further and said that really, if you want to have that culture of the best ideas winning, it's that which retains people. That's why they'll want to stay, because they see the best ideas winning. So what we want to do is we want to get to a place where everybody can have a good idea. And there's already pre-existing models for this. And the like of an Adobe Kickbox model is one that I like. I saw BBVA, one of the Spanish banks, take this on, where the idea is that we set aside time and money, small sums that escalate as the idea gathers maturity. And we say to people, look, here's $1,000 for coffee. You get a bit of an engineer's time. Take that idea, take a couple of days out of the mainstream and validate it. And then if that starts to gather momentum, then say, oh, well, actually, here's the next box, and it's 5,000. And in the case of BBVA, they used it to help engineering teams to sort of compete with one another for a common good, if you like, to improve how they were building their pipelines. Same idea. Suggestion here is keep the ideas nice and simple and small. Use a one-pager. So if somebody, you need to find a way when you open the gates to people's ideas, you need to have a mechanism by which you can say to them, listen, come to me with one page of text. Describe the problem you're solving. Describe the solution. Describe the complication. What is it that stops you from doing this? And then what's the upside? And it should be just one page. And generally, and don't accept 2 or a 6-point font, just one page. And if somebody is unable to do that, then probably the idea had no merit and they proved it to themselves. But once they have the idea and they bring it to you, then it needs to get attention and be either screened in or out, and reasons given for that. These are things that you can do. They're all absolutely free of charge. One thing that you can do to kind of get the juices flowing might be a hackathon, and bring customers in. So that's my suggestion there. Bring customers and partners in to help you with running some of these ideas, to get your teams up and running, and perhaps do it over a weekend, get a little bit of discretionary effort in there as well. Okay, so if we've got lots of ideas, how do we start to help our teams to overcome their fear of new ways of working? And I think the key to this is that you must have a demonstrably better way of working, which not only produces better business results, but which is also more motivating for team members. And in this regard, we like to talk about scientific ways of working, because scientific ways of working are very suited to one feature at a time, to this iterative model of customer engagement, because we want to run a little experiment and see if that works, and then run another little experiment. So hypothesis-driven development and discovery, and doing it for the first time, is something where you can bring an agile coach in, and you will organize a team, ideally, and put that team of people together from different silos in a very central place where everybody in the organization can see what's happening. You're going to start using Kanban boards to make work transparent to people for the first time. There's show and tells weekly, and you can invite the execs to come to that to see how things work. And all the time you're doing this, you're hypothesizing. You can start talking to finance about this feature that you're building and the probability that it might succeed. So we're starting to include people in our conversation, but we're also adopting all of these new ways of working, prioritizing by value, different ways of engaging people within the organization as well. And remember, we'll be asking for a C-suite individual to sponsor this, to remove blockers from us. I saw this work really well for South African bank, name eludes me, but I saw them do this for their pipeline. Okay, so in this way, and as the discovery team is making progress, we can start to actually see some success. If there's failures, we've got to show that those failures are things we're learning from. And so my suggestion here is, particularly if your coalition of the willing is building nicely, if there's a focus on customer and resolving customer pain through innovation, that we now undertake a discovery as a prequel to building in an agile way. So building more and more of these teams. But to do that, we've obviously got to have some success. And success comes in the form of people who are motivated to do this, and who feel empowered and who love the autonomy. And you can see it. I've seen this with our clients, where the engagement level just literally, takes off. And a large part of the reason for that is because they're working in much more planned and structured ways. So there's a lot less unplanned, let's call it alligator batting, and a lot more actual sticking to a plan and getting things done. The next thing that really disables organizations is governance. So I alluded to this earlier, the fact that we can have very long running projects. In fact, one of the fundamental problems we have with those big long running projects is that they remove accountability, because it's this fire and forget type approach. So I like using analogies, particularly when I'm talking to the C-suite, because it makes it easier to get them to understand what are sometimes complex concepts. But if you get the analogy right, then the C-suite can own it and they can use it to pepper town halls, and it can be a rallying call for when people lose heart. So there's one analogy that I've come across recently that I've written a blog on, actually, and I've kind of stolen it from a guy called Don Reinertson. And it's this idea that in World War II, there was anti-aircraft guns, and they used to fire at bombers that were traveling at about 280 miles per hour. And they used to fire at a point in front because it took 6 or 7 seconds for the shells to get there. And it was on average 15,000 shells to get one hit. So it was a fire and forget approach versus, and it was a hit and miss approach as well. Today, we're talking about surface to air missiles. The equivalent to a bomber now travels 8 times faster, and the SAMs travel at 3,600 miles an hour, but they're constantly in-flight adjusting because they've got onboard cameras and onboard telemetry that are feeding back to them what they need to do next. Now, for me, waterfall tools like Prince and PMP, they're focused on realizing value 2 years from now, when we have no real idea what the market's going to look like 2 years from now. Whereas one feature at a time, it's about that surface to air missile we've got automated customer feedback to tell us what we need to do, features to retain and grow or fail fast on. And we're constantly refining and adjusting this. And I take you back to, these are the things that Booking.com done. One of our other clients is Ryanair. This is how they do stuff. This is how they work. The reality for organizations, though, is that they have these long budgetary cycles, a board approval the following year, we set up a steering, and we set up CAB. And how do we take that apart? And the answer is very slowly. It's not easily done. I note that CAB has changed from advisory to approval board. And so you've really got to go at it kind of carefully. But I think one of the ways to do it is to actually get the customer to set the pace. And by that, I mean that you could perhaps get CAB to agree, well, look, we can change, we have forgiveness to put a feature in place that only impacts 2% of our customer base. And if that's working, then we'll come back for the risk assessment piece. You could get them also, one of the other things that I've seen is a lot of these changes we can put into an automation, so a patch or something like that. I mean, would the CAB accept an automation once, so we don't have to come back when we want to run that particular patch again? And this is kind of how the FaaTangs, as they call them, Facebook and Twitter and all, this is how they work. It's this forgiveness rather than permission and empowered teams. So we're coming near the end of my content. The last point about organizations that we work with is this idea that they can very often be fragmented. So if we have delivery teams, and let's say we've now gone past the initial discovery and we've got multiple delivery teams, ideally organized by product, and that's a whole other subject, the kind of project to product journey. But if they're organized in that way, then they need to have probably not more than 200 people in a product team. So that's 20 delivery teams or thereabouts. That's a kind of what's called a Dunbar number, which is the number of people that you'd feel comfortable to have a pint with in your local pub. That tends to be the human's capacity for human interaction. So you keep the product teams not bigger than that. But you also want to have people from HR and procurement assigned to these teams, not in a separate function, but actually working day to day. Their desks are in there, they're accessible. So this idea that we have those individuals in that team and that they're very much united by a common mission. So we have this idea that the overall mission is the most important part of the exercise. And the teams and the finance person, for example, that's working with that product team, yes, he obviously has to report into the finance function and the CTO, but he's like an ambassador or a representative into finance, and he sort of gets and understands what the finance folks, he understands their language, and he also understands the engineering language. So when we want to have that conversation about expensing software in a period of time, he can manage the detail associated with that. Okay, so I was asked by Sebastian to speak for 45 minutes, and that is exactly what I've done. I'll just kick on here. This is where you can access the book. It's probably going to be published, as in I'll give you a PDF of it within the next week or so. It's just in the final stages of graphics being added and so forth. So with that, I will stop sharing.